Flashing light warning in about 5 seconds, by the way, because like I mentioned last time, the world transition's a little bit flashy. That kind of hurts my eyes. Hello everyone, welcome back to Let's Play Donkey Kong 94. In the last one we started off the game, and now we've reached World 3, this ship. From memory on my first playthrough, this is around the point where I started dying a little more often than I started dying any kind of regularly. Because the first 2 worlds alongside the first 100 meters, I'm not going to say they're free, but they're simple enough platforming-wise with how they place the hazards and all that, where it's easy to get around things more regularly. World 3 Beyond is where things get a little more hazardous, on top of the fact it's where if you're trying to be overconfident, you can start costing yourself some lives just by trying to be showy and all that. Now, if memory serves, there is a way if you play this level well enough where you can get across the block guys on the top to where the platform you spawn in on the right is, and then get back down here in time to actually get on this guy as it walks to the right, but I've never been able to do that successfully. This is one of those games where the skill ceiling, if you're trying to master things, is pretty high, and honestly, watching a speedrun, or especially a task of this, is just a gorgeous sight, because the level of movement is just ridiculous. So, last time I mentioned when it came to the ropes you can swing around, there's going to be times you're getting to keep in mind your active speed as you spin so you don't go too far past where you want to go. You want to spin only maybe about 3 or 4 times there to get up here to where the key is, but if you want to go get that purse, you're going to need to actively go up there at least twice, and frankly, that's not worth it to me. Bit of a theme in this specific world, by the way, is that there's a lot of enemies you can just outright stand on, like the crabs you can stand on the shell of, though I think if you go on top of them while they're trying to attack, you will still take damage. Meanwhile, the night enemies, their entire deal actively is never damaging you at all. You can either stand on top of them, or their main goal is to actively push you around, particularly into hazards. This level introduces another mechanic of sorts, where there's going to be levels where there's just outright fake doors. With that said, they're more just a visual distraction than anything. Because while you might think that taking the key to the wrong door maybe costs you a life, or the key will just be taken out of your hands and respawn where it started, in this, it does literally nothing, because the way that the doors work in this game is that you don't actively put them into the door, you just stand in front of the correct door with the key, and you're automatically taken out of the level. If I had stood in front of the fake door, literally nothing would happen, and it always feels like it's weirdly generous, but also like there was meant to be something else there. I don't know how to phrase it, it's just kind of weird. This is a surprisingly complicated Donkey Kong level for as early in the game as we still are. This level is a good example of one of my least favorite parts about this game, though, and that is whenever you're in a level against DK himself like this that's not a proper boss fight, you're partially at the mercy of his own whims, because, for instance here, he has his own lever that will, A, change the direction of the conveyor belt I'm on top of, as well as open the door that is at the end of it. There's times where it feels like his timing when he wants to do that is inconsistent and devious to just try and kill you outright, which makes sense. But compared to the rest of the level, which feels relatively consistent in its timing, although I never liked how these 2 specific sets of moving platforms lined up, it just feels kind of weird, and I've never been the biggest fan of it. Not too often that really comes into play, but it does come up every now and then. Oh, also, because I probably should have mentioned this earlier, Mario does have a duck in this game, and there's going to be a few times you have to duck through thin passageways. We saw one of those with one of the night enemies, I believe, in the previous level. When you're being pushed like that, keep holding down, because it's kind of a Mega Man X6 situation of all things, although this did come first, where if you're crouching in an area like that and you let go of the crouch button, you stop crouching and crush yourself. I've died to that more times than I'd like to admit in the few times it comes up in the game. Also, here we are, about halfway done with World 3, I guess technically World 4 if you want to count the 100 meters, and we're already at about 2/3 the life total you can have at max. Again, lives are very easy to come by in this game, but not for nothing, on the first playthrough, they're also pretty quick to lose. Also, I might as well note this. At this point in the game footage, I've actively started ignoring the Pauline items, so the parasol, the hat, and the purse. Largely because getting them in the early game levels is more just to showcase what they did. They're not required for 100% in any regard. My goal in recording was to grab them up until the point where I would use the ladder to block the gate from closing in the one level to get through it super quickly, just so I had a chance to showcase them. That's the thing with fall damage right there, by the way. If you start falling too far, you'll even drop items. When that happens, that's the point where you'll at least get tripped up when you land. It's not necessarily an instant kill yet, but if you time yourself badly, it definitely can be. Speaking of shortcuts though, this next level sort of has one. What you need to do here in the intended solution is to use these two platforms to block the two spike pits so you can get over them, and then just ignore the robots up there as best you can. But if you're quick about things, you can grab them and place them in such a way where you can do a backflip up to the second one that I placed higher up here and get up to where the bag is and completely ignore the robots. There's several times in the game where you can do things like that, and it's super satisfying to figure that out on top of the intended solution pathway. Now, I've mentioned Pauline several times, so I might as well actively go out of the way to read the game's manual so I can go into one specific topic. Namely, the story for this game in the manual is, he's back! Donkey Kong kidnapped the beautiful Pauline and has run away. To save her, Mario must chase after Donkey Kong. The familiar game of Donkey Kong is now a Game Boy title. A totally new quest awaits Mario beyond the familiar scenes of the first few stages. Hunt down DK as he escapes from the big city, traveling on the ship through the jungle, the desert, Rocky Mountain, and onto his home. Can Mario capture Donkey Kong and save Pauline? The reason I go out of my way to read that specific manual is that, in retrospect, it's kind of funny to look back at the 90s and the early 2000s in a way, because Pauline was considered more of an extra character despite being one of the 3 original Mario and Donkey Kong characters outside of Mario and Donkey Kong themselves. Around the time of Super Mario Bros., she really did just get sidelined, because I'm trying to think. She was in the original Donkey Kong, I think a Game & Watch game, Donkey Kong Jr., this. And then after this, she got relegated to the Mario vs. Donkey Kong games, and barring the occasional cameo after that, I think her next time in a starring role was just in New Donk City and Odyssey. I guess it is kind of interesting thinking about that, because thinking about just the number of games she's been in and what games they were specifically, despite being Mario's original girlfriend, she really is more of a Donkey Kong character. Which does kind of tie in, I guess, to why they made Bonanza the way they did. It is kind of an interesting way to do things there. Even when done fast, this is probably one of my least favorite boss fights against Donkey Kong in the game, as the later in the game we get, the larger the levels get, of course, to the point where they take up multiple screens. Something about the Donkey Kong battles that take place across more than one screen length in any direction always just feel a little off, if only because there's more of a chance, I feel, for the barrels to come in from off-screen and just kind of blindside you, specifically when they get thrown and tossed and thus just bounce around like that rather than roll along the platforms. Not helping things is that while Mario in this game has some pretty good vertical speed, especially due to the backflip and the triple jump, because this is ultimately a game that's based on the original Donkey Kong arcade game, Mario's walking speed in this is pretty slow. Which works for the levels itself, but if you're actively trying to avoid attacks like barrels being thrown from off-screen that you can't see coming, it definitely feels a little sluggish. But that said, it works for the context it's in, and ultimately is still very fun to control. Mario controls like a dream, barring the potential occasional issue with this horizontal movement speed. Also, once again, real good example of how many lives you can just grab if you play the levels well here. I'm getting another 7 lives just from my time in the last 4 stages alone. The time trial mechanic, which I think is the technical title of that, really gives you a lot of lives really quickly, so game overs, even if you're losing a lot of lives, are pretty rare to come by in this game. Also, flashing lights warning once again as we now transition from the ship over to World for the Jungle. This world introduces one notable mechanic, but we're not going to see that until one of the Donkey Kong boss levels. Something you are going to see pretty regularly here, though, just because it's a jungle, is that the vine mechanics we saw in the one forest mini-boss is going to reappear here pretty regularly. And not for nothing, the little, like, mechanical alligator enemies there that I don't know the name of are one of the more annoying types in the game, because they can just climb those ropes pretty suddenly and unpredictably, depending on what you're doing. And there's times where I've just been blindsided by that because I'm not paying enough attention, or I'm low enough on a rope that it actively just comes up and kills me immediately. Watch out for the coconuts in these stages, by the way, because they can get knocked down by anything touching them, and they can both kill you and enemies. So there's times you can use them to your advantage, but there's also times where if you're not careful, it can just take your life as well. Also, there's a little bit of a mechanic there you can just barely see. There's times where they will place little, like, guide points in the level design to showcase where you might want to place a platform or a spring like that you can spawn in as an item. And while I don't think they're really necessary, there are times where, especially if it's the first time you're using something like that spring, it's appreciated, where it's very easy to underestimate the bounce strength of those springs, either if you're holding the A button or otherwise, and just get yourself into a bad position. Also, it took me way too long to realize in my first playthrough you could actively stand on the plant enemies in this game, which is pretty good to know, as there's one specific level near endgame where if you don't know that, you can still finish the level, but it definitely makes it a little bit hard on yourself. So at this point, let's start talking about this game's dev staff. It's a small team compared to some other projects we've seen, but some pretty key people involved in the development of this, surprise, surprise. They actively start by listing the executive producer, who, get this, is Hiroshi Yamauchi. the CEO of Nintendo at the time and descendant of the founders of Nintendo, who was listed in pretty much all of their projects from the time they started doing video games, even till after his death back in 2013. After that is, get this, there's this guy who's the main producer called Shigeru Miyamoto. I feel like he's probably nobody. Yeah, just created Donkey Kong and Mario and Zelda and is still largely involved in the production role these days, but I think for a good while there, his priority was working on the theme parks and all that, and I think he's involved in the movie production nowadays more than anything. I think I talked about this back in Wario Land 2, but we are slowly reaching a point where a lot of, like, the old blood Nintendo people are going to be retiring, leaving the industry, or the other thing, that it's going to be a little of a weird paradigm shift, honestly. We're definitely at a point where there's enough new blood who are getting their name out there where we're going to have probably a new generation of sorts, but it's going to be a weird moment. Anyway, right there was the other mechanic that this world introduces. Donkey Kong Jr. himself is a mechanic. There's going to be some levels where he just shows up and is going to randomly swap switches on or off, and you have to keep those in mind, as it might lead some pathways open for you, it might close some off, it also might leave some hazards or enemies open to you that could potentially kill you. Speaking of hazards, one we're going to start seeing pretty quickly here that we saw in that cutscene right then is a mini mushroom that shrinks Mario down to a smaller state. There's times where having that can be a benefit because it does mean you can squeeze through smaller passageways that you wouldn't normally be able to walk through. You'd normally need to get pushed through them. But a lot of the time, they're going to use it as a hazard because Tiny Mario can't do a lot. If memory serves, he can swim, and that's it. Because they can't climb ropes, they can't climb ladders, and I think they might even have a smaller height distance before they actively die via fall damage, but don't quote me on that. Future me, see if you can see anything about that online. Next up in the dev staff, though, are the game's two directors, Masayuki Kamiyama and Takao Shimizu. And a little bit of a rarity, both of these people actively started on the same project. They both have their first listed entry on Moby Games, at least, on Famicom Mukashi Banashi Shin Onagashima, which I believe was a Famicom Disk System exclusive text adventure game. Both directors were involved on the technology side specifically. Shimizu is credited as a part of the technology staff, meanwhile Kamiyama is listed as a programmer. After that, Kamiyama actively was a scenario assistant for Earthbound Beginning / Earthbound Zero. They then worked on Radar Mission, Wave Race for the Game Boy, this, Snoopy Concert for the Super Nintendo, Mole Mania on Game Boy, Mother 1 and 2 on the GBA, as well as remakes and ports of Famicom Mukashi Banashi on the GBA and Wii. Meanwhile, Takao Shimizu, after Mukashi Banashi, was a programmer on Famicom Grand Prix 2, was in the special thanks for Earthbound Beginnings, as well as Super Mario World, of all things. They were a coordinator on Link to the Past and Wave Race. They were on the support side for Star Fox 1, meanwhile Argonaut was developing that. They were a producer for Kirby's Adventure. They were both a director and course designer for this, actually. I'll get to that separate set of credits in a moment. They were a co-producer on Kirby's Dream Course. BS Legend of Zelda, they were actively the director of that specific project. Star Fox 64, they were a director. They were an advisor on Kirby Superstar. They directed both of the Pokemon Stadium games that were released here in the West, so Pokemon Stadium 2 and 3 in Japan, respectively. Assistant director on Mario Sunshine, producer on Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, producer on Mario Galaxy, producer on Jungle Beat on Wii. But after that, they were mostly in special thanks roles, although they did direct Star Fox 64 3D, as well as produced Ocarina of Time 3D and Four Swords Anniversary. This is a good level that showcases Donkey Kong Jr. just messing around with the Switch to change the level design and all that, opening pathways for you to both access other platforms on, but also for other enemies to access you outright. And as far as I can tell, when he decides to do that is largely random. I think there is maybe a periodical element to it, but it definitely doesn't feel like a consistent, 5 seconds or so. It definitely feels like there is a bit of variance to it. Maybe it depends on your own animations and all that, or where you are relative to them. I don't know. It's never quite felt right to me. And it's why actually any level where Donkey Kong Jr. shows up is usually one of my least favorites, rather. This is another level you can kind of ignore a good half of it by just getting up to this platform with a backflip, but watch out for those mini shrooms because that can lead to death pretty quickly. But if you're careful about things, you can actually use the coconuts on the top right to take care of that little alligator before it even becomes a threat to you. And trust me, I recommend doing that because this is one of those levels where if I'm not careful, I can just easily take a death from the alligator just coming up to say hi to me at the very last second. Because I believe with the speed you climb a singular rope rather than 2 ropes, the alligator will catch up to you no matter what and kill you. With that said, with 2 ropes, I think you will outspeed it. Mind you, changing that as easy as just tapping left or right on the D-pad once, so pretty quick to fix that issue. Next up in the game's main staff, though, are its two main programmers, specifically Masayuki Hiroshima and Yoshiaki Hoshino. Masayuki Hiroshima started actually on Phantom Fighter on the NES as a production assistant. Then they were on Pool of Radiance as an ECL programmer. They were a programmer for Wave Race on Game Boy. Their last two listed credits, on Moby Games at least, are in Tane Omakutori, which was a WonderSwan exclusive puzzle game about a raven, I believe, as a programmer, as well as Cardcaptor Sakura Itsumo Sakura-chan to Isho on the Game Boy Color as a programmer. That, I believe, is a Cardcaptor Sakura puzzle simulation game where you're trying to find cards. I think I saw someone talk about that at one point on YouTube on some just obscure video that auto-played, I want to say. This is a level I have often overthought right here. What you need to rely on here are these monkeys we've seen for a little bit now that you can hold onto the tails of like they're ropes. You can even hold onto two of them to keep them completely still. What you need to take advantage of here is something I often forget you can do in the game for some reason, where if you spawn in a platform like this with a switch or one of the platforms you can spawn in yourself, and it fades with an enemy on top of it, they will actively fall down, and you can take advantage of that here, alongside the fact that the monkeys work kind of like Red Koopa Troopas from Mario, where they'll just walk left and right on a platform and turn around when they hit an edge, to get across the spike pit with the switch in the proper position so that you can access the key and thus leave the level. I don't know why, I just constantly forget that gravity applies to enemies in this game for really no reason as far as I can tell. It's just something I have consistently forgotten actively exists in levels like this. Probably because it doesn't come into play that often, even though there's probably times you can take better advantage of it than I can. Specifically when it comes to picking up enemies and throwing them at others, or even just moving an enemy from one side of a stage to another to maybe use them as a platform in some cases. So the other main programmer for the game, as we already mentioned, is Yoshiaki Hoshino. They started as a staff member on Radar Mission for the Game Boy. They were a programmer on Wave Race, and the special thanks for Snoopy Concert on the Super Nintendo, programmer for Mole Mania on the Game Boy, a programmer for the Shigesato Itoi base fishing game on the N64, and then they were a programmer for Hamtaro Ham Hams Unite on the Game Boy Color, as well as Ham Ham Heartbreak on the Game Boy Advance. Now, you can kind of already see the trend starting to show up in the names I'm mentioning, but a lot of the people who worked on this game, when they weren't actively big-name Nintendo employees, worked on a lot of the same games together. This, Earthbound Zero, the two Hamtaro games I just mentioned, Mole Mania, Wave Race, Pokemon Snap, I believe, also falls into that. That's because a lot of them were actually from a very specific second-party developer that worked a lot with the Nintendo at the time, known as PAX Softnica. They actively started developing a game called Soreyuki Kurukuru on the PC 6000 series by NEC, which was, I believe, released the same year as the original PC 8800 series. That was where a lot of Japanese game development happened at the time. Specifically, that's even where Ys started, for instance. And they worked with the Nintendo and made games all the way from 84 all the way up to, I believe, 2002 before they dissolved in 2003. I think there's a successor company that's just known as Softnica that has the same president, but from my research, I can't find much of what they've done, so they're probably either a shadow company that largely does a lot of support work, or the games that they release seldom ever get a lot of notation written down about them, which, yeah, that tracks. There's actively a lot of games that falls into. Heck, I know there's that number from a while back where it's like, I think like 85 to 90% of games just aren't playable nowadays. And while there is a lot of that that's just games from the NES on that weren't really taken care of, or bootlegs and all that, there's also a lot of that's just due to what PC development was at the time, with things like the Commodore 64, where people could have their games released worldwide or in specific markets, or especially a lot of the Japanese PC markets at the time, like the PC-88s and the MSXs and all that, where a lot of the games just aren't as really talked about as much. There's a whole lot to history to games that we just kind of ignore, at least in terms of like the mass spectrum of things, that can be a really interesting read that I really recommend people look into. That boss fight's not a lot to write home about. Usually Donkey Kong will throw the barrels either straight down or at either extreme. And you really want to take advantage of the handstand to bump off barrels that are trying to fall down, because that can give you ammo pretty quickly. But at the end of the day, it really just depends on what you're doing. So before we end off, we got one more tutorial to show off here, the Super Hammer. The Super Hammer works pretty much the same way animation-wise as the main hammer, and you can use it to kill enemies. But the Super Hammer is actually a cameo from Wrecking Crew that can actively destroy blocks. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're going to move on to World 5. See you guys then.